They were the six most infamous and talked about women of the 16th century, the 6 wives of King Henry VIII. Their lives were all changed for the worse when they married the King of England, and some of their impacts are still felt today. 2 of the wives lost their heads inside the walls of the Tower of London in brutal fashion, and still today they are laid to rest inside of a royal chapel. Their graves have been searched for, and one of these queens has been exhumed in the centuries after her death. But the treatment of Henry VIII's wives in the years after they died was nothing but shocking. 2 had their tombs desecrated and smashed to pieces, and another was forgotten. Her mortal remains left in the heart of Westminster Abbey with very little recognition. In this documentary, we look at the reasons why these royal burial vaults were opened and why the remains of Henry's wives were disturbed. And to support our channel, please make sure to subscribe.
From an early age, Catherine's life was intertwined with the political ambitions of Spain. England and Spain sought to strengthen their alliance against France, and a marriage between Catherine and Arthur, the Prince of Wales, was arranged when she was just 3 years old. By the time she was 15, she was sent to England to marry Arthur, thus stepping into the heart of English politics. Catherine arrived in England in October of 1501 after a long and arduous journey. She first met Arthur, the eldest son of King Henry VII, shortly before their marriage. The 2 were wed on the 14th of November 1501 in St Paul's Cathedral in London, amid much celebration and pomp. However, the marriage was short-lived. The couple moved to Ludlow Castle in the Welsh marshes, where Arthur fell gravely ill, possibly of the sweating sickness, and died on the 2nd of April 1502, only 5 months after the wedding. Arthur's death left Catherine in a precarious position. As a young widow, she became both a political pawn and a symbol of the alliance between England and Spain. There was immediate discussion about her marrying Arthur's younger brother, Henry, the Duke of York, who would later become King Henry VIII. However, complications arose. Church law forbade a man from marrying his brother's widow unless a papal dispensation was granted. Catherine insisted that her marriage to Arthur had never been consummated, a claim that would later prove central to her fate. Catherine spent several difficult years in limbo after Arthur's death, residing at Durham House in London with a reduced household and limited finances. She became a sort of unofficial ambassador for her father's interests in England, displaying great diplomatic skill during these years. Finally, with a papal dispensation secured, her marriage to Henry was arranged. On the 11th of June 1509, 2 months after Henry's ascension to the throne, Catherine married the young and handsome king just days before her 24th birthday. Catherine's early years as queen were marked by success and mutual affection. She was intelligent, dignified and capable, and Henry seemed genuinely devoted to her. She also played a significant role in English politics. When Henry left to fight in France in 1513, Catherine was appointed regent and successfully managed the kingdom during his absence. She even organised the defence of England during the Battle of Flodden, where the Scottish king James IV was defeated and killed. Despite her accomplishments, Catherine's primary duty as queen was to produce a male heir, and this became the central tragedy of her life. Over the course of their marriage, Catherine endured multiple pregnancies, but most ended in stillbirths or early infant deaths. Her only surviving child was a daughter, Mary, born in 1516. Though Henry initially celebrated Mary's birth, his desire for a son soon overshadowed his affections for Catherine. By the 1520s, Henry's frustration over the lack of a male heir grew, particularly as he became infatuated with Anne Boleyn, a lady-in-waiting in Catherine's household. Convinced that his marriage to Catherine was cursed because she had been his brother's wife, Henry began to seek an annulment, claiming that the union had never been valid in the eyes of God. Catherine, however, refused to submit to this argument, insisting that their marriage was both lawful and sacred. Henry's quest for an annulment, later called the King's Great Matter, sparked a political and religious crisis. Pope Clement XVII, pressured by Catherine's nephew, the powerful Emperor Charles V of the Holy Roman Empire, refused to grant Henry the annulment he desired. Catherine herself fought tirelessly to maintain her position as queen, appealing to the Pope and passionately defending their marriage. In the June of 1529, Catherine appeared at the Legante court at Blackfriars, where Henry's case for annulment was being heard. In a dramatic moment, she knelt before Henry and declared, "Sir, I beseech you for all the love that hath been between us, and for the love of God, let me have justice and right. Take of me some pity and compassion, for I am a poor woman, a stranger born out of your dominion. I have been your true wife for many years." Her plea moved many, but Henry remained determined. When it became clear that Rome would not rule in his favour, Henry broke with the Catholic Church, establishing the Church of England with himself as its head. In 1533 he declared his marriage to Catherine annulled and married Anne Boleyn. Stripped of her title as Queen, Catherine was demoted to Dowager Princess of Wales, a title that referenced her first marriage to Arthur. She was sent away from court, separated from her daughter Mary, and forced to live in a series of damp, uncomfortable castles, including Kimbolton Castle. Despite her suffering, Catherine never accepted the annulment, continuing to call herself the rightful Queen of England until her death. Catherine spent her last years in increasing isolation and ill health, likely suffering from cancer. Her steadfast refusal to acknowledge Anne Boleyn as queen or to accept her own demotion made her a figure of sympathy and admiration amongst the English people, who respected her piety and dignity. She wrote touching letters to her daughter Mary and to her friends, always displaying her faith and resilience. Catherine of Aragon then died on the 7th of January 1536 at Kimbolton Castle, aged 50. In her final letter to Henry she wrote, "Lastly, I make this vow, that mine eyes desire you above all things." Even in her final moments, Catherine maintained her loyalty to Henry despite the years of humiliation and suffering that she endured. Catherine of Aragon was to be buried in Peterborough Cathedral with the rank of a dowager princess, with this completely disregarding the marriage she had with Henry VIII. Her funeral was significant and large. Her body was carried into the cathedral in a coffin, and it had previously been embalmed in the Tudor ways. Her heart was removed and to be buried elsewhere, as were her insides and vital organs. In a burial vault near to the altar, Catherine's body was placed in what was said to have been a grave at the lowest step of the high altar, over which they put a simple cloth. However, the burial vault and tomb would be broken into, or at least despoiled significantly. It is believed that Henry VIII had a tomb made for Catherine, which went over the grave, but during the turbulence of the English Civil War, anything which was related to the idea or establishment of monarchy was subjected to assault and desecration by parliamentarians. Peterborough Cathedral was ransacked by forces of Oliver Cromwell in 1643, and his men, despite the fact they were meant to be displayed, lay waste to the cathedral. They stole riches and valuables, but more importantly, they began to attack tombs and targeted the tomb and burial vault of Catherine of Aragon. The forces smashed it to pieces with weapons, taking parts of it away, and after they had done with it, there was very little left. Now, it's not known for certain whether these men managed to break into the burial vault itself or just targeted the tomb. If they had broken into the burial vault, they would have found Catherine's coffin alone, as she was not buried with anyone else. Now, there is a rumour that exists, and also a local legend, that during some building work, presumably when the new grave marker was placed above the burial vault, that the builders drilled into her coffin by accident, and that part of the burial shroud came away with the drill. However, the truth about this is debated. If undisturbed, inside the coffin is the wrapped body of the first wife of Henry VIII, which was covered in a thick cerecloth, a wax-dipped cloth aimed to protect the body. For centuries, bodies have been protected by these coverings, and they protected the body well, leading to the conclusion that Catherine of Aragon's corpse could very much be almost as fresh as the day she was buried. As mentioned, a new memorial slab was placed over her grave, and this was paid for by women named Catherine, who donated money to the fund. She was the first wife of King Henry VIII, who fell from favour at the king's wandering eye and went towards Anne Boleyn. But Catherine of Aragon was a queen, and should most certainly have been remembered as one.
It was on the 19th of May 1536 that Queen of England Anne Boleyn, the second wife of King Henry VIII, was summoned from her prison cell inside the Tower of London, and she was informed that she was about to die. Now, a few things about the execution of Anne are rather disturbing, including the fact that her husband Henry VIII had ordered a French swordsman for the job weeks before even her trial had taken place, showing that it was more of a murder than a judicial execution based on legitimate crimes. Anne would have made the short walk from her prison cell to the execution scaffold, which had been specifically built on the side of the White Tower, the oldest central part of the tower. Her execution was allegedly private, despite the fact there were hundreds gathered to see her demise and fate. As she was led up to the scaffold, she saw the executioner, and she remained calm, but she then made a short speech to the crowd. She claimed, "Good Christian people, I am come hither to die. For according to the law and by the law I am judged to die, and therefore I will speak nothing against it. I am come hither to accuse no man, nor to speak anything of that, whereof I am accused and condemned to die, but I pray God save the king, and send him long to reign over you. For a gentler nor a more merciful prince was there never. And to me he was ever a good, a gentle and sovereign lord. And if any person will meddle of my cause, I require them to judge the best. And thus I take my leave of the world and of you all, and I heartily desire you all to pray for me. O Lord, have mercy on me. To God I commend my soul." The French swordsman stood behind her, and Anne knelt down, and he struck with his sword once, and her head was taken clean off. After the execution of the Queen, Anne's ladies, who were crying, collected her body and remains and placed them inside of a large oak chest, which previously had housed bows or arrow staves. They then carried this into the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, which was next to the scaffold, and there a short burial ceremony took place. Anne Boleyn's remains were joined by others who would be executed inside the Tower of London and on Tower Hill during the Tudor period, but for around 300 years they were left undisturbed. In 1848, a historian who visited the Tower of London and the chapel where Anne had been buried stated about the state of the site of royal burial. "I cannot refrain from expressing my disgust at the barbarous stupidity which has transformed this little interesting church into the likeness of a meeting house in a manufacturing town. In truth, there is no sadder spot on earth than this little cemetery." The chapel was in a bad way, and the constable of the Tower agreed that urgent repair work needed to be done, and Queen Victoria approved of this, and significant improvements were done to the burial site. Queen Victoria wanted to protect the place as a site of royal burial, but one of the biggest issues inside of the church was the fact that the floor was sinking and was heavily damaged. It was stated by one of the builders that, on removing the stones of the pavement, it was found, as reference to the burial register too abundantly proved, that the resting places of those who had been buried within the walls of the chapel during the troublous times of the 16th century had been repeatedly, and it was feared, almost universally desecrated. When the Tower ceased to be a residence of the sovereign or a state prison, the chapel of St. Peter's appears to have gradually come to be regarded too much in the light of a mere ordinary parish church, in which the interment not only of those who had lived in the Tower, but even the residents in the neighbourhood, were freely permitted. It is true that the bodies of those who had perished on the scaffold or died as prisoners within the walls of the Tower were buried, no doubt intentionally, in great obscurity. But even if some memorial stone had recorded their burial place, it is doubtful whether that would have protected their remains, for in the instance of 3 Scotch lords, Lovat,
Balmenio and Kilmarnock, although their graves were specifically marked by a stone, which is still preserved, it was found that their bones had been much disturbed, so much so indeed as to be beyond all possible means of identification. It's even feared that in some instances coffins had been designed brokenly up and their contents scattered in order to make room for some fresh occupants of the ground. So many of the bodies of those who were executed inside the Tower of London were found and discovered, but all those who died on Tower Hill. Also mixed into the collection of remains were the bones of local people who had come for years to the chapel to worship, and they were interred there. However, one of the bodies the builders discovered was analysed by archaeologists and specialists, and this was confirmed as being the remains of Queen Anne Boleyn. Dr. Frederick Mellott, the Professor of Medicine to Queen Victoria, helped carry out examinations, and he stated that Anne's body belonged to a female of between 25 and 30 years of age, of a delicate frame of body, and who had been of slender and perfect proportions. The forehead and lower jaw were small and especially well formed. The vertebrae were practically small, especially one joint, the atlas, being that next to the skull, bearing witness to the Queen's little neck. He then stated, "The bones found are certainly those of a female in the prime of life, all perfectly consolidated and symmetrical, and belong to the same person. The bones of the head indicate a well-formed round skull, with an intellectual forehead, straight orbital ridge, large eyes, oval face, and rather square full chin. The remains of the vertebrae, and the bones of the lower limb, indicate a well-formed woman of middle height, with a short and slender neck. The ribs show depth and roundness of chest. The hands and feet bones indicate delicate and well-shaped hands and feet, with tapering fingers and a narrow foot." He said that Anne would have been roughly 5 foot tall to 5'3" when she was alive, and he confirmed that indeed a sharp weapon had been used to take her head from her body. He also claimed that she had a small neck, the same small neck that, according to contemporary Tudor accounts, Anne had. The remains of Anne were taken outside of the chapel, and they were stored inside of the Queen's house, in the corner opposite, for a number of months whilst the building work took place. They were then sealed up inside of a new lead coffin, and copper plates were placed on top, identifying who the remains belonged to. It was on a rather cloudy day in April that the bones were then reinterred of the Queen inside of the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula. Builders helped to do the job, and there was a short service. The men watched on as the boxes were then reburied 4 inches below the surface, and carefully noted were the positions of the burials. On top of where Anne was buried, a marble decorative tile floor marks the place where she was buried. She was interred below the communion table, second in from the left on the first full row of burials. She was buried between her brother George Boleyn and Edward Seymour, the Duke of Somerset. The men who were carrying out the building work would open the grave of Anne Boleyn, and they had a rough idea that she was buried close to the high altar. No DNA analysis took place on her remains, which would have completely confirmed that the bones belonged to Anne Boleyn. There have been some rumours that some of her remains may have been moved out of the tower, but still today it's believed, even by the beefeaters who work inside of the Tower of London, that the bones of Anne Boleyn are interred below the altar of the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula.
Jane Seymour was a queen who was not as highly educated as the other wives of Henry VIII, but she is considered his most beloved. Jane was a peaceful and gentle woman who was seen as a good match for Henry VIII, who could rage very much. But Henry and Jane were betrothed to each other on the 20th of May 1536, a day following the execution of Anne Boleyn. Jane and Henry had been seeing each other behind the back of the king's second wife, Anne Boleyn, and the pair married on the 30th of May 1536, and Jane was a very different queen as to the other women. She was not crowned because of the plague in London. However, Jane was a strict and formal woman, and she did not lead an extravagant household which brought balance to the Tudor royal court. She was close with Henry's stepdaughters, but Jane did suffer a tragic miscarriage in the Christmas of 1536. However, when she fell pregnant again with the king's child, it would be everything Henry VIII wanted. During her pregnancy, Henry VIII pulled out all the stops for her, and she lived a very quiet life during her latter pregnancy before she entered her confinement in the September of 1537. But Jane gave birth to the male heir, Edward VI, at 2 o'clock in the morning on the 12th of October 1537, inside of Hampton Court Palace. Edward was christened 3 days later, and Jane was not there. But Edward VI was the legitimate son of Henry VIII, and he was so wanted. However, Jane's labour had been very tricky and difficult. It was very long, and it lasted 2 days and 3 nights, due to the positioning of the baby. But following Edward's birth and christening, it was then clear that Jane was not very well at all. Inside of Hampton Court Palace, in the very bedchamber that she gave birth to the next Tudor king, Jane Seymour died on the 24th of October 1537. There were differing causes of her death, including an infection caused from her placenta, or that she may have suffered childbed fever, which was sustained after an infection following giving birth. Others have said that she died from a pulmonary embolism, and Henry VIII was devastated by her death, and he went to Windsor, and the court were mourning clothes, and the king also spent a while in mourning. Henry did not have much involvement in sorting out the funeral proceedings, but he chose that she would be buried inside of Windsor Castle St George's Chapel. This was an indication of the king's grief, as he usually involved himself in planning huge ceremonies. On the 25th of October, Jane Seymour's corpse was embalmed and eviscerated. Her entrails were removed from her body, including her heart, and her heart was actually buried away from her body and was placed under the altar of Hampton Court Palace's Chapel Royal. She laid in state inside of Hampton Court's presence chamber, and her remains were then laid in a lead-lined oak coffin. On the 10th of November, the funeral procession arrived at Windsor at 11 o'clock, and they were greeted at the entrance by the Dean of St George's Chapel and others. 6 pallbearers carried the body inside, and they were met at the high altar by the Archbishop Thomas Cranmer. There were many prayers then made, and the body lay in state whilst the future Queen Mary I kept vigil over it. The following day further masses were sung, and on the 12th of November a huge ceremony was held to lay the Queen to rest with full honours in a burial vault beneath the Garter Chapel, which had been made for her. This burial vault was very small and would not be very big compared to others inside of Westminster Abbey, where royals were held. Following the funeral ceremony, the Queen's officers placed their broken staves of office inside of her grave, and the bells of London tolled for 6 hours. The burial process took an hour, as the vault was then sealed. The period of mourning for court came to an end on February 3rd, 1538, with the king confirming this. However, 9 years later, Henry VIII would also be buried inside of this small vault. When Henry VIII died, there was space inside of the vault for Henry, who had a much larger coffin than Jane's. Hers was dainty and small. It was never planned for Henry VIII and Jane Seymour to lay together at rest for long in the burial vault. There was no tomb or grave marker, but Henry VIII left instructions for he and Jane to be buried in a grand monument and tomb, presumably to be placed inside of Westminster Abbey. However, over the next few centuries, their burial vault would be broken into a number of times. The first time it was disturbed was following the execution of King Charles I in 1649. Charles had lost his head following his trial and the loss of the English Civil War, and because of the worry across England that his remains would be dug up and venerated, Parliament made the decision to bury him inside of the same quiet and small vault as Henry VIII and Jane Seymour. Because of this, the vault lid was lifted, and Henry VIII's coffin was moved, and this broke the trestle it was resting upon, so that Charles could be placed next to Henry. This was a Stuart king being buried next to a king that very much hated the Stuarts and banned them from ever becoming kings and queens of England. but during the burial of Charles it was noted that Henry's coffin, which was much larger, was in a bad state, and much of the exterior wood was broken into, and some witnesses claimed that they could even see into the coffin, and could see the beard hairs on his face which had been exposed to the elements. However, Jane's coffin was said to have been in a perfect state, and something that looked as fresh as the day it left the carpenter's workshop, being made for a queen. There was no sign of damage on this, and no breakages. It was laying peacefully where it was buried over a century before. However, this was not the end of the breaking into the burial vault, as a child of Queen Anne, another Stuart monarch, was buried inside of the vault at the feet of Jane and Henry for some reason. So the burial vault was now very crowded, especially as it was only ever meant to house 2 people for a short period of time. But the final time the vault containing Jane Seymour's remains would be broken into was 1813. There was work being done to the chapel, and a passage was being made for priests to access the new royal vault. The old vault containing Jane and Henry was broken into, and it was witnessed by Regent George, the future King George VI, as well as other officials. They were looking to confirm whether Charles I's remains were inside of the coffin, and they did this by lifting his coffin and then also looking at the remains. They confirmed the damage to Henry's coffin, and it's believed that no repair work was ever carried out on this. However, Jane Seymour's coffin, around 300 years after she was buried, was still in a remarkable condition compared to the other burials in the vault, and there was still no breaking of the wooden shell, and it still remained on the trestle, and this had not collapsed. Because of the state of preservation, and also the fact that Jane would have had her body wrapped in cerecloth, a thick wax-covered cloth that preserved bodies very well, it's fair to reach the conclusion that Jane Seymour's corpse could still today be in a very good state, and it may not have decayed almost 500 years on. This is remarkable, considering she was the ill-fated wife of King Henry VIII. Jane Seymour, though, was a woman who was very different to the other queens and wives of Henry VIII. She was a calm and gentle soul, but a woman who did not opt for the frivolity of being a queen. She was practical, and she gave the king his male heir that he greatly wanted. It's not been recorded that specifically Jane's coffin was ever opened. However, it is noted that it was in very good state. But her burial vault was disturbed a number of times, and today it is marked with a simple engraved stone slab saying that she is buried next to her husband, the most notorious King of England, Henry VIII. Anne of Cleves was born in 1515 in the German Duchy of Cleves, part of the Holy Roman Empire. Her family was Protestant-leaning, and her upbringing was modest compared to some European courts. She did not learn to sing or dance, nor was she trained in complex court etiquette. Instead, she was taught how to run a household, manage estates, and work dutifully as a noblewoman. This background later became important because it shaped her calm and practical personality and set her apart from the dramatic, finely educated ladies of Henry VIII's court. Henry VIII, by the late 1530s, was in a difficult position. He had broken from the Catholic Church, dissolved monasteries, and made England independent from the Pope, and this left him politically isolated, and he looked to form alliances with Protestant German princes. Thomas Cromwell, Henry VIII's chief minister, believed that a marriage with Anne of Cleves would strengthen England's position on the European stage. Henry agreed to consider the match, and the famous court painter Hans Holbein was sent to paint Anne's likeness. Holbein's portrait showed Anne as a modest, dignified and attractive, in a reserved way, girl. Henry approved the match based on the portrait alone, and negotiations continued. However, when Anne arrived in England in late 1539, Henry was deeply disappointed. He claimed she did not resemble her portrait and described her as nothing so fair as hath been reported. Whether this was due to actual differences or simply Henry's changing taste is still debated. Anne was not ugly. Several contemporary observers described her as tall, healthy and pleasant-looking. This difficulty was that she did not behave in the flirtatious or courtly way that Henry had preferred. She followed German customs, remaining formal and quiet, which Henry misinterpreted as dullness. Henry went through with the wedding on the 6th of January 1540, though he was reluctant. From the beginning, the marriage was stained, and Henry claimed that he could not consummate the marriage, saying he found Anne unattractive. He blamed her figure and her clothing, and later told his courtiers that he liked her not. Anne, unfamiliar with English customs and the expectations of a wife in Henry's court, did not know how to engage him or change his mind. Meanwhile, Thomas Cromwell, who had engineered the marriage, began to fall from Henry's favour. The unsuccessful union gave Henry a reason to move against him, and by the summer of 1540, Henry decided he wanted the marriage ended. Conveniently, Anne had no interest in resisting. She understood the dangers of opposing the king, especially after witnessing the previous fates of his wives. When Henry's counsellors began to ask whether she would agree to have the marriage annulled, she cooperated. The marriage was officially annulled in the July of 1540. The grounds were that Henry had not consummated the marriage and that Anne had previously been contracted to another nobleman. Anne accepted the annulment gracefully. Her wise decisions saved her life. Henry rewarded her for her compliance with generous financial settlements, including Richmond Palace and Hever Castle, the childhood home of Anne Boleyn. From this point onwards, Anne lived comfortably as an independent noblewoman in England. Henry referred to her as his beloved sister, a status that placed her above almost every other woman in the kingdom except his daughters, Mary and Elizabeth. She maintained good relationships with Henry and his children, and was often invited to court for Christmas and major celebrations. In many ways, she enjoyed more freedom than any of Henry's other wives. She did not have to please the king, or produce an heir, or compete for attention. She simply lived a peaceful life among her estate. Anne witnessed the fall of Thomas Cromwell, executed just days after her marriage was annulled. She also lived through Henry's marriage to Catherine Howard, who was executed for adultery, and then Catherine Parr, who outlived him. Through all this, Anne avoided political entanglements and stayed out of court intrigue. If her marriage had been a failure, her later life was quite a success. After Henry VIII died in 1547, Anne remained in England. She maintained her friendship with Princess Mary, who later became Mary I. And when Mary became queen in 1553, Anne participated in her coronation and was given a place of honour. However, during Mary's Catholic reign, Anne's position weakened slightly. As a German Protestant, she no longer fit neatly into the new religious environment, and her visits to court became less frequent. Still, she was never persecuted, and she continued to live comfortably. Anne of Cleves died on the 16th of July 1557 at the age of 42. She had been suffering from a long illness, possibly cancer. Immediately after her death, her body was embalmed, and with this process her internal organs were cut from her body and removed. This was traditional for the bodies of royals and high-ranking people in Tudor society. The physicians would have made a large cut into her chest and then removed the heart, liver, lungs and other internal organs such as the intestines. This created a cavity, and it was then washed and filled with spices and sweet-smelling things. Then the body would be washed again and wrapped in a thick, heavy wax-dipped cloth known as a cerecloth. This cerecloth was a shroud and acted as a protective layer to the remains in order to keep away decay and rot. These cloths have been known to have been so effective that the bodies of kings buried 500 years ago are in remarkable states of preservation, and they look as fresh as the day they died. The funeral of Anne of Cleves was rather large. There was a huge procession. Her coffin, which was lead-lined and had an outer wooden shell, was processed to Westminster Abbey, and it was then left in the abbey for the evening. When the time for her burial came, she was interred on the south side of the high altar, in a low stone structure and tomb. On 3 sides of the tomb show the carvings and initials AC with a crown, a lion's head and skulls and crossed bones on. The back part of the tomb was covered by the later monuments. Now, for centuries, this burial was rather mysterious, but then in 1970s, the words Anne of Cleves, Queen of England, born 1515, died 1557, were added. Her tomb looks like an altar. However, it is not recorded that this burial vault and tomb has ever been opened. She was placed inside the centre of the tomb, and because it hasn't been opened, we must consider that her remains may actually be perfectly preserved. There's no record of her body being disturbed either, so the combination of the cerecloth and the lead lining may have protected her body well. What is also interesting is that the tomb is very small and modest, and would only have enough space as to inter one coffin and one person, but most importantly, Anne was buried very closely to the shrine of Edward the Confessor, a key spot inside of the abbey, in the most holy part of the abbey. Now, her tomb has actually been used in the coronations of most monarchs, and it sits close to where the coronation chair is placed. As her coffin and tomb have not been opened for almost 500 years, it is unlikely that it will ever be, meaning that we'll never know truly what state of decay the fourth wife of King Henry VIII's remains are in, and she may in fact be perfectly preserved, which is strange to think. Now, Catherine Howard, as mentioned, was the fifth wife to the infamous Tudor King, and she was not married for long. Her uncle was the influential Thomas Howard, the Duke of Norfolk, and he managed to get the young Catherine a place at court. She served in the household of Anne of Cleves, Henry VIII's fourth wife. However, Henry VIII was known for his wandering eye, and he looked to sleep with women in the households of his wives, and his eye was captured by the young Catherine Howard. Her family were given huge amounts of land and wealth, and the young Catherine allegedly began to sleep with the king. And her family members encouraged her to do this, which was disgusting. Catherine was also given many gifts and expensive jewels, and the king even referred to her as the very jewel of womanhood. And she had also been described as delightful. The king himself was many years older, over 30 years older in fact. But after Henry VIII had annulled his marriage to Anne of Cleves, he asked for Catherine Howard's hand in marriage, and the teenager married the king on the 28th of July 1540, on the very same day that the king's close friend and chief adviser Thomas Cromwell was executed upon Tower Hill. Catherine was too young and carefree to be involved in matters of state and government, and following the marriage the couple went on honeymoon, but the marriage was doomed from the very start. Before the marriage, it's believed that Catherine Howard was in some form of relationship with the king's favourite courtier, Thomas Culpeper. He had succeeded to the queen's affections and continued to, despite the marriage, and this was a very dangerous thing. Despite being married to Henry VIII, Culpeper and Catherine continued to meet up in private, and they exchanged love letters, and allegedly they had a physical relationship behind the king's back. Thomas Cranmer, the Archbishop of Canterbury, investigated the rumours around court about this and discovered one of the love letters written by the Queen to Culpeper. Cranmer then informed the king whilst he was praying inside of the Chapel Royal in Hampton Court Palace, and he was informed that his wife was committing adultery behind his back with his close friend. Catherine was then held under house arrest and was later transferred to the Tower of London. She would have known that this was a site where her predecessor, Anne Boleyn, Henry VIII's second wife, lost her head, and she knew that this would be her fate, the fate that would one day greet her. Before this, Thomas Culpeper and another man linked to Catherine Howard, Francis Derham, were executed upon Tower Hill, and their heads were placed above London Bridge on a pike, and it's claimed that Catherine on her journey to the Tower passed under the heads of her former lovers, and that she screamed. And she was then taken into the infamous prison and fortress by barge through Traitor's Gate, the entrance where many notorious prisoners would enter the Tower. Arrangements for her execution were then undertaken, and she had been sentenced to death by an Act of Attainder, this being a law which allowed Henry VIII to do what he pleased, and Catherine did not face trial, as this could have brought more shame to the king. The execution of Catherine Howard
was scheduled for 7 a.m. on the 13th of February 1542. And the evening before, the young woman then practised laying her head upon the executioner's block, to make sure that she could do it in a way that the executioner would only need one swing of the axe to take her head off. The following morning, Catherine Howard, the young teenager, was then taken to the execution scaffold, walking towards Tower Green and the White Tower. And on the scaffold she claimed that she deserved to die, and that she deserved 1,000 deaths for her betrayal of the king. The executioner took her head off in just one swing of his axe, and Henry VIII would then have his vengeance. He had not ordered a coffin for his fifth wife, and her body and head were then collected in a shroud, a piece of cloth, and she was then taken to the Tower of London's chapel, the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula. Her body was then thrown into a roughly dug grave, and there was no preparation, or very little, for her burial, and it is not believed that she had a funeral. Catherine Howard's execution and burial was ruthless and brutal, and she had been executed by the commoner's axe, forced to lay in hay soaked up with the blood on the scaffold. She also did not die as a queen, being stripped of the title, and the only people who witnessed her burial were the officials within the tower, such as the constable of the Tower of London. She was buried wrapped in a cloth and was then placed in the ground. A significant amount of quicklime was then thrown into her grave too, upon the orders of Henry VIII. This was ordered as the king wanted to dissolve and decay Catherine's remains and body quickly, and he wanted to wipe her off the face of the earth, as if she had never even existed at all. Henry VIII wanted to rid himself of the mistake of his fifth wife, being cuckolded by his best friend, and to do this, the officials in the tower threw the quicklime on her body. Now, during the reign of Queen Victoria, there were many improvements made to the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, and the floor in particular was lifted and was fixed. The builders disturbed the graves which were close to the altar, and the royal physicians and doctors confirmed the identity of many of the bodies, such as Anne Boleyn, Henry VIII's second wife, and also the illegitimate son of King Charles II, the Duke of Monmouth. The remains of other prominent Tudor figures, such as Thomas Cromwell, the king's chief adviser, were located, and a number of women, including Margaret Pole and Jane Boleyn, were found. Now, Jane Boleyn had been executed immediately after Catherine Howard, as she was the one who had helped Catherine cheat on the king, and it was presumed that they were buried next to each other, in probably the same grave. It did not make sense that the two had been buried in separate graves across the Tower's chapel, as this would have disturbed other graves. Now, only one pit would have been dug for both of them, a pit large enough to inter two, but Jane Boleyn's body was discovered and found, and then archaeologists looked for Catherine Howard's body. They searched all around, and it was thought that she was buried close to the high altar, but they could not find her body or her grave. The grave proceeded to believe that her body had been covered in quicklime after her burial. Close to where Margaret Pole, the Countess of Salisbury, was found, there has been said to have been a small collection of bones which were affected by lime, and these could have belonged to Catherine Howard, but despite searching, her body was not identified and was not discovered. The body of Catherine Howard has allegedly never been found within the Tower of London's chapel. Her place of burial there is a memorial stone in front of the altar for her. People think that she is buried under the stone, but sadly that is not the case. The quicklime, it's believed, decomposed her body quicker, as she was so young, and that her bones were not fully hardened, as she was just a teenager when she was executed. Catherine Howard is remembered today as the most tragic wife of Henry VIII, as she was someone who was groomed and abused by older men, and the king, who was grotesque and huge at the time of the marriage, was over 30 years older than her, and he should have known better. It's possible that some of the remains inside the Tower's chapel, which were found, have been misidentified, but they have never been DNA tested. But if this occurred, then it could confirm if Catherine's body is still lying under the floor of the chapel inside the Tower of London. Her execution was rough and brutal, and she was a woman whose life changed when she married Henry VIII, but not for the better, and within a matter of time she would be executed, and the king wiped her remains off the face of the earth.
Henry VIII is remembered today as the notorious Tudor King of England who had 6 wives, and 2 of these would lose their heads inside of the Tower of London. But Henry VIII's final wife was Catherine Parr, who many believed nursed the king in his final moments before he died. However, Catherine was a woman who, despite being a survivor, could very easily have experienced execution herself. She came close to losing her head or being burned at the stake as a heretic for being too radical in her religious beliefs. But following Henry's death, Catherine Parr scandalously married quickly. But following giving birth to a daughter, she succumbed to death herself, and she was buried closely to the rooms where she passed away inside of the walls of Sudeley Castle. However, her coffin was broken into and disturbed a number of times, and what those who broke into her remains did was shocking and harrowing. Catherine Parr was believed at the time of the Tudor period to have been a too radical Protestant, and many inside of Henry VIII's government believed she was leading the king down a path of more ruthless religious changes, and she was not the most popular woman. She was a woman who had married before, and Henry's final wife was very different to his other wives, and she was more of a scholar than a doting wife. She married Henry VIII inside of Hampton Court Palace on the 12th of July 1543, and was made the first Queen of England, who was also made the Queen of Ireland. She was the Queen up until Henry's death, and she had throughout her life even acted as the regent whilst the king was away in France. She involved herself in educating the future Elizabeth I. However, after the king's death, Catherine Parr fell in love again with Thomas Seymour, the first Baron Seymour of Sudeley, and he was sniffing around for more power. The pair had a long history together, and Seymour saw his opportunity to marry the new Dowager Queen as a way of getting closer to the throne. His brother Edward Seymour was made the Lord Protector of Edward VI and the chair of the boy king's Regency Council, and Thomas Seymour was very jealous about this. Edward Seymour was now acting almost as a king. However, Catherine Parr and Thomas married in secret, but when the information about this came to light, there was a huge scandal. Catherine's actions in accepting marriage so shortly after Henry's death were seen as shameful and disgraceful, and Edward VI was not impressed with this, and Catherine then joined forces with her new husband to take on Edward Seymour. However, despite never being pregnant before or having any children, she became pregnant with Seymour's child, and at the time childbirth during the 16th century was incredibly risky. It could be a death sentence for a woman, and Catherine's risk was heightened as she was slightly older. Complications could have been fatal. At the time, she was living inside her husband's castle, Sudeley, and she continued to help educate Lady Jane Grey, the 9-day queen, whilst being pregnant. But then she entered her bedchambers to give birth to a daughter, who arrived on the 30th of August 1548. But Catherine Parr never recovered from childbirth, and on the 5th of September she died inside of her rooms days after giving birth. After her death, Thomas Seymour left his castle, and the funeral was arranged, and it would become historic, as it was the first fully Protestant service to occur across England. The chief mourner was Lady Jane Grey, and Catherine's body was embalmed inside of her bedroom by physicians, and it was then taken inside of the chapel, St Mary's Chapel, next to the castle, and she was prepared for burial. She was to be buried in a huge ornate tomb that was made for her, and was then placed on the north side of the chapel, and on this tomb was an effigy of Catherine, and it had a Latin inscription on the bottom of it. However, Catherine Parr's remains were disturbed many times over the following years, and her coffin was shockingly broken into. In 1642, the tomb of Henry VIII's sixth wife was destroyed during the English Civil War as Roundhead forces of Parliament's army smashed up the chapel and desecrated her monument as she stood for monarchy. However, her body was also disturbed, and the grave was smashed to pieces and dug up, and it was said that
There is in the castle a godly fair church. Here they dug up the graves and disturbed the ashes of the death. They break down the monuments. However, in 1782, a number of people arrived at Sudeley, and a group of ladies who had an interest in history wanted to find the remains and tomb of Catherine Parr. Inside of the chapel, they found a block of alabaster marble in the north wall from her tomb, and some men dug underneath it, and they came across the lead-lined coffin of Henry VIII's sixth wife. These group of people then opened the coffin, and what they found was remarkable. They found Catherine Parr's body wrapped tightly in a cerecloth, a heavy wax dipped in cloth which had been almost mummifying her to preserve her. They saw her face for the first time in 2 centuries. However, as her corpse was exposed to the air for the first time, the colour of Catherine's face drained, and her eyes turned a different colour, and lost their sparkle. The women then asked the men, after their curious outing, to rebury her body inside of the coffin. But a local farmer found out about what had happened inside of the church nearby, and he tried to inspect the body of Henry VIII's sixth wife himself. It was said that, in the summer of the year 1782, the earth in which Q.K. Parr lay interred was removed at the depth of about 2 feet, or very little more. Her leaden coffin was found quite whole. Mr. Lucas had the curiosity to rip up the top of the coffin, expecting to discover within it only the bones of the deceased. But to his great surprise, he found the whole body wrapped in 6 or 7 cerecloth linen, entire and uncorrupted. His unwarranted curiosity led him to make an incision through the cerecloth, which covered one of the arms of the corpse, and the flesh of which at the time was white and moist. He made an incision and uncovered one of the arms, and he said that the flesh was white and moist, and he also cut off a few locks of the Queen's hair, as well as some material from her cloth and dress which was buried in. In 1783, just a year later, the steward of the castle then directed for the grave to be opened again to see the Queen's remains, and it was said that the body had begun to decay quickly. It was also noted that the shoes were on the feet which were very small, and that the Queen's proportions were extremely delicate, and that her hair was gold. 4 years later, the coffin of Catherine Parr was yet again opened. This time it was a curious local priest who wanted to see the state of her body, and he had found that the head of Catherine had totally decayed, and presumably no skin was left. He also found that teeth had fallen out of her mouth, or may have been pulled out by those hungry to take a souvenir of the wife of Henry VIII. However, he also found when inspecting the remains that her hands and arm had turned brown, and he made a short sketch of what he saw in her body. He then covered up the body, but 6 years later, one of the most shocking parts of Catherine's desecration occurred. A group of drunk vandals entered the chapel, and they then disinterred Catherine Parr out of the coffin and messed around with it, and one man even danced with the corpse of Catherine Parr. They then dumped the body of her in the corner in a pile, making off with some more teeth, and one man allegedly even stabbed an iron bar through the torso of Henry VIII's final queen, and then had buried this in the ground upside down. Hearing of this, a local priest then appealed to Queen Victoria to give Catherine Parr a better and deserved burial in a final monument where she could finally be laid to rest after centuries of desecration. It was agreed that Catherine would be buried inside of a new coffin and a new tomb which was made from stone, and she was interred in safety. When the time came to rebury her inside of the newly renovated church within the grounds of the castle where she died, it was found that Catherine's body was just a pile of bones now, with a smaller part of flesh and hair on her body. But she was then buried inside of this new tomb where she still lies today, in decency. The horrific story of those people who opened the coffin of Catherine Parr were a mix of criminals and curious, and she was in death not given the respect that she deserved, but she is a woman who is considered a survivor of the brutal reign of Henry VIII, but she could have experienced execution herself. But what happened to her coffin over the centuries was shocking and barbaric.